right, so my name is Mike Sellers. We're going to talk about systemic game design today. Thank you all for coming at 5:30 on Saturday. Honestly, wasn't sure anyone was going to show up, so this does my heart good. So I want to start here, sort of what this talk is about. If you're interested in designing games, how many people here are game designers, consider themselves game designers, or want to be game designers? Awesome, excellent. So if you want to make games, and especially if you want to make more engaging games, and especially if you heard James Portnow earlier today talking about how we need to get past fun, then I hope you'll find this talk interesting. What I hope you take away from this is a new way to think about games and game design, and maybe something that actually leads us towards some game design theory. So this isn't a how to animate better sprites talk or how to do better cosplay, though that would be awesome. This is a how to make better games talk. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. This is a talk I've given a couple of times in different forums at different academic and industry conferences. This is my sort of first time doing this at a community conference. To give you an idea of my own background, I made my first paper role-playing game in 1985. Made my first company and first MMO in 1994. That game was released in 96. I've been in the games industry since then, working on a variety of projects. These are all a bunch of projects that I've led. The biggest has got to be a Sims 2. Rumble in the Mad Gods, another one I'm proud of. Holiday Village, no one knows about, but I love it. The last one is a textbook on advanced game design that I just had published last December. I've been working on that for about the last 2 years. And what I'm talking about today is is in large part based on that. There's just a small part of the book. As I said, I've been in the industry for more than 20 years and have been at Indiana University for the last 3.5 years, where I'm the director of the game design program. We have an undergraduate game design degree there that we're very proud of. So we have a lot of different kinds of game systems. We talk a lot about combat systems and economy systems and things like that, but we often are pretty vague about what these mean. So the main point that I want to get across today here is that games are systems, and that by thinking about games as systems, we can actually make some really interesting headway in terms of what games are and how we can make better games. So we're going to dig into that a bit here today. So to start with, we need to talk about what's a system. I'm going to mercifully skip over a whole bunch of history going back to Aristotle and Isaac Newton, and I'm not kidding, and Wittgenstein, and the 20th century Deborah Meadows and Luhmann and a bunch of people, because boy, you can spend a lot of time on that, and I'm guessing everyone had a late night last night. But we can talk about sort of what a simple definition is for a system. Systems are made of parts. That's the first basic thing we need to think about. Pieces on a chessboard are a good example. Each piece has state and behavior, meaning that a chess piece always has a location on the board and a certain way it can move. So that's its behavior and what it can take and things like that. Pieces or parts in a system are all connected together. However, if they're connected only linearly, then they don't really make a system. In systems thinking, there's a differentiation between something that is complicated versus complex. Launching a rocket is complicated, lots and lots of parts, but stage 1 affects stage 2. Stage 3 never goes back and affects stage 1. So it doesn't really form a system in that regard. Something that's complex has parts that affect each other where they make a loop. And this is really the key to... Really?
No, it's too cold outside. Allegedly.
Every year.
Well, on that note, thanks very much.
Are you going to be around, maybe not doing any other company, will you be like in the indie area or somewhere?
I will be around. I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing. This is very odd.
I don't know. Any time that you're free to finish this?
I don't. We can talk to the staff. I'm happy to do so. Hold on.
What? Can we stop doing vacuuming? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's stopped.
You know what, evacuate. I guess. Sick. Yeah, sweet. Yeah, keep going. One back.
Okie doke.
Running it back.
Now we just wait for the chaos to settle.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's like they said it on Apollo 13. That's the glitch for this mission. So I'm sure it's fine.
I'm sure you've heard of Catacon 2016, which there actually was a fire, and it was just as cold as this weekend is. Just a cold snap. They kicked everyone out. People like in spandex, just not prepared for the cold. And we were outside for an hour, and then there were like all these stories. Nobody knew exactly where the fire was from.
Wow.
All we knew was that it wasn't a false alarm.
Yeah, yeah.
Where's the kitchen? Where's the kitchen?
It was a kitchen.
It's like some said it was the kitchen, some said it was the maid cafe, some said people were trying to smoke in one of the rooms.
No, the one a few years ago where that was actually a legitimate fire.
Yeah. But
Wow.
But it took months before we actually figured out what the true story was.
Well, we'll go ahead and continue here, but be ready to leap up if the flames do. All right, let me go back just for a second. Okay, so we have parts that are connected and they form loops, and this is the forming the loops is really the heart of what systems are and how we make systemic games. I'll talk a lot more about that. That's really going to be the core of this. So the thing about when you make loops is they actually make another emergent whole, and we'll talk a bit about emergence, that it's integrated, persistent, and adaptive, and how we can get to this in our games. The final thing is that in systems, and especially in games that are perceived to have depth, we not only have one loop like this, but we have a hierarchy of loops. So you have systems within systems within systems. And this is, if you stop to think about this, can get kind of mind-bending, but really that's it. I mean, that's what a system is. Now there's obviously a whole lot more to it that we're going to go into it, but in terms of the basics of what a systems is, that's it. So now that we have established loops a little bit, we can talk about some basic kinds of loops and start doing interesting things with them. So the two basic primary kinds of loops are reinforcing and balancing loops. These are sometimes called positive and negative reinforcement, but that's a little bit of a misnomer because positive, what reinforcing loops aren't always positive. You can be reinforcing yourself right into the ground, and not all, some balancing loops tend to balance between two qualities, not necessarily be negative reinforcement. So loops are what we have happen again when you have mutual parts that interact together. So you can have compound interest. The more money you have, the more interest you earn. The more interest you earn, the more money you have. So that builds on itself nicely. Or a monopoly, the more money you have, the more properties you can buy. The more properties you buy, the more money you get. And then on the balancing side, you have things like you set an oven to a certain temperature, and as the oven gets, and you apply heat, and then as that oven gets close to that temperature, you apply less and less heat. There's lots and lots of examples like this, and really interesting, strange things that happen. I'm not going to tell the whole Cobra's story, but does anyone know the Cobra head story? Okay, so I'll tell this one quickly. This is apocryphal, but I love it. In the 1800s, when the British ruled India, they saw there were too many cobras around, and so they said, hey, we will pay you for cobra heads that you bring in. And so they started paying people for cobra heads, and the cobras went down. The number of cobras went down. But then they started noticing that people were still bringing in cobra heads even though they didn't see any more cobras around. And they said, hang on, we're being taken for a ride here. And so they said, we're going to stop paying for cobra heads. What do you think happened next? Lots of cobras. Because in the meantime, people said, hey, I can farm cobras, and they will pay them for me. And then when they stop paying for them, well, I'm going to let all these cobras go. And so now you have even more cobras than you had before. So that's one of the things you can have when you get balancing and reinforcing loops interacting. Now we're going to look at these in terms of a lot of different game structures. This is a couple examples. On the left you have rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock, which if you don't know, you should. And on the right we have the Chinese 5 elements. This is the basis of Chinese alchemy. Both of these are what are called transitive structures, where you have, in each case, the rock, paper, scissors is easier to see. Everything in that beats 2 other things and is beaten by 2 other things. So you beat half and are beaten by half. And so what you have is a combination of reinforcing and balancing loops that makes an interesting structure that is overall balanced, even though any given part of that is completely unbalanced. If you reduce it to rock, paper, scissors, if you play paper, then scissors are always going to cut you. Always be beat by scissors, and you'll always beat rock. You'd be surprised how easy it is to get that wrong when you're trying to talk about it to a group of people, so I hope I got that right. But this is just an example of how you can combine reinforcing and balancing loops to create interesting, larger structures that end up being adding up to gameplay. So we can take a look at these looping structures and look at 4 different kinds of loops that we see within a game. So the first one is loops that are actually within the game itself. So you have systems that operate inside the game. And then the second is loops that operate inside the player's head. So one of the things you're trying to do when you're learning a game is you're building up this mental model you have inside your head of what's actually happening in the game. And the closer your mental model matches the systems in the game, the better time you're going to have. When those models don't match up, you go, hang on a minute, that didn't work at all. What I expected didn't happen. So the third one is where we put those together. And you have this interaction loop now between the player and the game. So we'll see this again in more detail in a few minutes, but where the player has an intention they do something in the game does something inside and gives feedback to the player, and that creates your interaction loop. And that right there is the basis for all the interaction, engagement, and fun we have in games. The fourth loop is one we don't often think about, but is really critical for game designers. And that's how you as a game designer interact with the loop between the player and the game. So when you're doing playtesting, what you're doing is saying, try this out. And the players do it and they go, oh, that's really cool. So you get feedback and say, that's great, do more of that. They say, I don't understand that at all. Okay, I have to change that. So you have this designer's loop that is sort of the outermost of these loops, these interactivity loops between and within the player and the game. So I'm going to go through some of these quickly, but we'll touch on most of these today. So within the game itself, we have a few different types of game systems that we can identify and that you can build games out of. The first of these, we have engines, economies, and ecologies, and then sort of multi-layered combinations that we'll get to. And the whole point of this, what I'm going over rather quickly in this talk, is that if you spend time understanding these, you can analyze games and understand them more completely, and then create games more effectively by using these kinds of structures. So an engine is pretty simple. It's it builds up a particular resource. So you are taking a single resource and either building it up, or which is called a boosting loop, or you're taking it down, which is called a breaking loop. These have other names in other parts of the industry, dynamic and friction engines, for example. So in this example, you mine ore and you can sell the ore and get some benefit from it, or you can invest the ore, say to make better tools and get more ore out. So you have this primary reinforcing loop that adds up with this resource that then you can use for some other effect. But it has to do with one resource in particular. The next kind is called an economy, and this is rather than having one resource with a primary reinforcing loop, you have multiple resources where you exchange between them. And you can see this actually has a little engine within it. So you have in this case, I'm saying this backwards, you have in this case people who are cutting wood and selling that wood to get bread, which allows them to have the energy to cut more wood. Or you can take some of that wood and not sell it for bread, but make a sawmill and actually make lumber, which is then worth more. So you can actually boost your the overall gain you get by exchanging wood for lumber rather than just wood for bread. So this creates a higher utility exchange, we see this in a lot of games. You may not realize it, but as you'll see in a minute here with role-playing games, for example, every time you kill a monster or gain a new skill, you're doing this kind of loop where you're gaining something either by investing it or by exchanging one resource for another, time or health for damage, for example. And we can chain these together. So this is not a complete system diagram because it doesn't form a full loop, but you can see where we can go from ore to steel using several successive economies. So in any kind of a builder game where you're making one kind of resource into another, into another, into another, this is how you build a game economy. These are sort of the Legos for a game economy. And then this shows a parallel track as well where you have people that you can convert, quote unquote, by training them into more skilled workers. You need to build an academy or something to train those workers to do more for you. And this is a common kind of high-level diagram for a game economy, which obviously can become far, far more complex in the particulars, but this kind of diagram holds true for all of them. Now, if you have an engine which is reinforcing one resource and an economy which is reinforcing across resources by exchanging resources, the next one is an ecology where you don't have a primary reinforcing loop, you have a primary balancing loop, again, going across resources. So this is a diagram for how wolves and deer try to balance each other. The more deer there are, the more wolves can eat. But the more wolves there are, the fewer deer there are. So they tend to balance each other. And eventually they both die, make dirt, which the deer eat to grow more deer. So this is a high-level ecology. And then you can, by zooming in on the deer part of it, we can actually see there's actually a lower-level ecology within that as well, where the deer use the external resource of plants and end up balancing their own growth, because you can only have as much deer as you have plants, and then the deer eat the plants, make fewer plants, which means fewer deer, so some of the deer die. So you have external sources and sinks, source for the plant and sink when the deer die. So this is just sort of within that other higher level ecology, we have this lower level one. We can chain all these together. So this is a high level diagram of a typical role-playing game where you have an overall outer reinforcing loop. If you think about it, your character's always getting better, or dead, but hopefully better. And they do that by going through this loop here, where you have on the top right there, you have a role economy, which is if you are in a party of other people, you are all working together, exchanging resources, the strengths that your characters have, to do combat better. And combat is an ecology because you and the other monsters, the things you're fighting, are trying to balance each other, which is a very nice way of saying you're trying to kill each other. If we assume that you come out of the combat ecology on top, then you move into these other subsystems here. We have, for example, a skill economy. I'm trying to read these all myself. An item economy in terms of getting better things or like crafting better items. And then the inventory ecology is kind of an interesting one to think about. In games like Diablo, for example, you can only get so much stuff, or World of Warcraft does the same thing, where you can only get so much stuff and keep it in your backpack. And the ecology there is you have more stuff, you have less space, and you don't have an infinite amount of stuff. And you can actually make quite a bit of gameplay out of, for example, in WoW, I got a bag, or I got a bigger backpack. Or in Diablo, this sort of Tetris-like ways that they said, well, I have this great spear, but I can't keep it in my inventory because I don't have enough pieces that that are long enough for doing so. So there's some interesting sort of ecological gameplay there. Now, we don't think of that as a typical ecology, but anytime you're balancing off two or more resources like that, you have the same sort of balancing ecological effect. Now, these are all within the game. Remember I said they had the game, and then next we can talk about systems within the player and then how those interact. So in an earlier panel, we talked about fun and engagement and things like that. It turns out there's a really interesting definition for engagement in humans, and psychologists have used this, where if you have a situation where you are applying vigor, you're applying energy to the situation, you are dedicated to it, so it's not just a momentary thing, and where you're absorbed by it, where time seems to go by, you're not paying attention to things around you, that's a situation where you are said to be engaged. And there are tons of these. I mean, driving a car is the easiest one. Boy, that example is going to go away in a few years. But there's lots and lots of situations. If you are in a conversation with someone that you're attracted to, you are engaged, maybe eventually really engaged, but you are engaged in that you're psychologically engaged because you're exhibiting all three of these qualities. In the early 1900s, there was a couple of psychologists, Yerkes and Dodson, who made what's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which is shown here, that shows that as the difficulty of a situation increases and as your skill increases, your performance goes up and then goes down. And what that means is, as your skill increases, your performance goes up, no question. But at a certain point, your performance drops off. There's too much stuff happening. If you think about a simple game like Tetris, you can get better at that game and you can survive for longer. And that's really the whole point of that game, is how long can you survive. But at some point, your performance drops off because they're just the tiles are coming at you far too fast. This is, again, a common situation that happens in all sorts of things. In games, what we're trying to do is to keep people right about at the peak of the Yerkes-Dodson curve or just to the right of the peak. There's something not shown here called the expert effect, where if you have someone who's never been in combat, physical combat before, and bullets start flying and there's loud noise and things like that, people will very quickly drop off the right side of that curve and become paralyzed and unable to act. However, people who are veterans who have been in combat before, their performance goes up and stays up and then drops off very precipitously at the end. They can only take so much, but they can take a lot more because they're experts. This is true of anyone who has accomplished expertise. So you have a surgeon can handle lots of things going on in surgery, far more than any of us could, because they have been trained to do so. But even then, there are limits. Now this is, you've probably all heard of flow. Hopefully? Yeah, okay. You can think of this curve as like a cross-section of the typical flow graph, where you have the challenge on the y-axis and expertise or skill on the x-axis. As you go up and to the right, your challenge goes up, and it goes up not quite linearly, more sinusoidally with your skill. So if your skill is too high for the challenge, then you're bored and you stop playing a game, for example. If the challenge is too high, then you hop out because you are anxious or anxiety is sort of the typical response to that. Now there are exceptions to this. Everyone says, what about Dark Souls? Well, in a game like Dark Souls, you kind of know going in where you're going to be on this graph. And it's not going to be in a flow state. So a flow state is typically where you are thoroughly engaged and things drop away from you. You're applying vigor and dedication, and you get in that middle, and that's where people have the experience of enjoyment, engagement, enjoyment, and when there is a positive reinforcement on the outside of this, fun. Though, as we talked about in an earlier panel, games can be engaging without being fun. I don't think it's possible to be fun without being engaging, but that's an interesting thing to think about. So I want to talk a little bit about different kinds of engagements. This is, again, now all within the player's head, and we can start right sort of the sub-basement of all of our experience and our own neurology. There are 4 basic kinds of neurotransmitters that we can talk about that pop up a lot. So dopamine is the effect that you get for an expected reward. It's the ding effect, and we're all really susceptible to it. It's the let's do that again. That was great. And when you do something that your brain likes, it's going to tell you, do that more. That's really good. Serotonin is the companion to dopamine. It's much more about being secure, both feeling secure, but also it's really interesting. Your brain releases a lot of dopamine when you get validation that you are part of a social group. When you come here and you see your people at MAGFest, your brain lights up with serotonin. It's like, this is awesome. This is the place to be. Then on another dimension, you have oxytocin and vasopressin, which oxytocin is typically called the cuddle chemical, these are all about social bonding. I love this story. I always tell it when I bring this up. When you stare into someone's eyes, both of your brains release oxytocin, unless you're really angry with each other. The only instance of that we know of is when you stare in your dog's eyes, your brain releases oxytocin, and so does the dog's brain. Cats don't do this. Only dogs. The only other species we know other than humans that do this with humans is dogs. And so what they say is when your dog is looking at you lovingly, your dog really is saying, I love you. So it's good to know. The last one, norepinephrine and endorphins, these are all about persisting and sticking through something that's painful. So if you say, this part of a game is hard or this part of a game is kind of a slog, if you get through it, what your brain is going to release is endorphins, just the same as if you get through a 10-mile run, or you get to a certain point they call the wall in a run, where your brain suddenly releases all these endorphins because it says, yes, you made it through the pain, that's a great thing. So these are all, like I said, sort of the fundamental pillars underneath a whole lot of other stuff that we'll go over here as we go on. So moving up from the sort of the basement of the brain in terms of engagement, we can look at these different levels from perceptual, cultural, and we're going to look at these really quickly here, that will help us understand systemic engagement between the player and the computer. So that takes us to this loop here. We've talked about, very briefly, I realize, about systems within the computer, systems within the game, I should say, not necessarily the computer, systems within the player. And then we can look at the same kind of systemic loop between the player and the game. And we'll look at them in those terms I just had up here just a moment ago, and how we can separate those out to make better games. So this is just a slightly more detailed version of the previous diagram, where the player is forming an intention, takes an action, that action feeds into the game. The game does something internally, this with the game's rules, feeds that back to the player, and the player forms a new intention, updates their mental model, and forms a new intention. This also highlights where lots of games go wrong. So you can have, if the game is too simple, then every time I make action A, feedback B results. the game's not interesting to me. I learned that very quickly. This is why tic-tac-toe isn't interesting past the time you're about 6 years old, because it's just that you know exactly what's going to happen. Or if the game is doing things internally and it doesn't give you good feedback, or gives you mistaken feedback or contradictory feedback, you aren't able to build your model. Or if you don't understand the controls. Anyone here try to play Dwarf Fortress? Yeah, so Dwarf Fortress fails right at the top of this. I have an intent. What do? I have no idea. So we're going to go over...
Hours of reading a manual,
yeah,
and then you can make that first act.
exactly. So my intent is to read the manual. No. See,
This is how I dig.
yeah, exactly. So we're going to go over each of these, the levels I was talking about just a minute ago. But one of the things I want to point out is that each of these varies, as you'll see, in duration and in the length of their effect and their urgency in particular, as well as a few other factors that you can see here and that I'll make clearer. What this adds up to, though, is a graph that looks like this. We can look at different kinds of interactive loops between the player and the game, where you have the AF is action feedback, which is also perceptual on the left-hand side, all the way to cultural on the right-hand side, going from short to long and most urgent to least urgent, and you'll see how that all adds up here. So to start with the action feedback loop, this is something that's called reflexive attention, where you don't have a choice but to attend to it. If you see an explosion or see something unusual, normally I would say something like, if someone walked in the room dressed as a dragon, you would look. In this crowd, maybe not. It's less unusual. Like it or not, reflexive attention is typically outside of our control. It's something that grabs your attention. The best example I know of that in games is from Peggle. I love this one. Now let me start this here and then stop it real quick. So I just want to let you look first, just visually. There's a whole lot of stuff going on here. The colors are bright, they're shiny, everything's really saturated. You'll notice that as things happen in the user interface, the balls here on the left, they'll click and they'll bounce up and down a lot. There's just a lot going on there, and then it goes really off the rails. So in Peggle, you're shooting these dots. Hear the sound going up. Oh, that's nice. And then watch this. The dopamine in your brain, the dopamine cells are just going, oh, that's the best thing ever. It's, I will confess that when I was looking for this video online and found it, and I just watched it a couple times. It's like, yeah, that's great. The rainbow, extreme fever. I mean, man, that's kind of awesome. So the point of this, though, is that we have we're all very perceptual creatures. We like neat sights and sounds. We talk about juice in user interfaces where things move in interesting ways and look and sound really interesting. And that hits us at sort of the next to lowest level being the neurochemical level, and just up from that we have this perceptual level, and we're all very affected by that. The next levels up are short-term and long-term cognitive, and this is where a lot of games sit, and it's also where a lot of people get really bored, so I'll go over this quickly. But this is where we get into what's called executive attention, where you as your executive, you are deciding, I will build these units and not those units. I will attack that country and not this one. So this is where you pay attention what to attend to, and what to do. Short term in terms of puzzles, long term in terms of strategy, which we'll see more of in just a few minutes here. Lots and lots of games focus here. And this, plus the action feedback we just talked about, really make up the bulk of the dopamine release that you see in games. When you play Sudoku and you get that last number, there's a little part of your brain that goes, oh, that's great. Or when you level up in a role-playing game, or you make a jump in a platform you couldn't make before. All these are things where you have an expected reward, and when you get it, your brain really lights up. But these are all very cognitively focused. Now, a lot of game designers, I would say the bulk of game designers, have focused on short-term and long-term cognition, along with some of the action feedback, for the majority of the history of games. But there's a lot more that we can do. The next kind of interactivity is social interactivity, which is fantastic for making games that have staying power. This is where we see more serotonin. It's linked with more serotonin release in the game, as well as some oxytocin. When you make a friend in a game, you think about in an MMO when you're fighting something and it's about to kill you, and someone else comes along and kills it for you, and you're very happy because you didn't die, and then you talk and you make friends, your brain is going, hey, this is a good thing. Do this some more. Here's a little bit of serotonin. When you're in a guild and you say, I want to be a guild leader, and then you're a guild leader and you're trying to do a good job at it, and people say, yes, you're doing a good job, that's again releasing a little bit of serotonin. We have these social bonds that we release that we have in our brains, in our lives, that are very, very important. There's a game I've mentioned in a couple other panels. You may have heard me say this before, that I like to point out a lot. A game, it's called Game of War Fire Age, that to my mind has still done the best job of creating gameplay around purely social bonds and monetizing those. They do this a couple different ways. One is that if I need help building my buildings faster, it's a sort of a standard free-to-play mobile game. Other people in my alliance can click on a button that says, help Mike, and it'll help me, and my things go up faster. So there's already social interactivity there. The other one, though, is if I buy a package for $50 in the game, I get my $50 package of cool stuff I bought in the game. And if you're all in my alliance, you all get a message that says, Mike just bought $50 in the game. Here's a gift for you. It doesn't cost me anything, but it makes you feel like I've given you a gift. Mike's great. I just got this gift from him. And the second thing that happens is you go, I want to have other people get a gift from me too. So I wasn't going to spend any money on this game, but I'm going to spend $20 on it. And that way everyone says, hey, Bob bought something, and now you get a gift for a $2 gift. And that sets up what's called social reciprocity. And this is why social games work so well. Sorry, games with social elements. Games we call social games are often not very social. But a lot of online multiplayer games have these kinds of reciprocity elements in them that help us interact that way. And this has longer staying power than just the purely cognitive interactivity. So the next one is emotional interactivity. And this is a part of game design that we really didn't explore a lot for many, many years. We had an earlier panel on the mechanics of love where we talked about some of these things. But this is where we get into what's called reflective attention, where you don't just attend to something like as a puzzle or a strategy. You take it away and you think about it later on. So if you play a game or watch a movie and it sticks with you, that's where you're reflecting on it, and that's your reflective attention. It takes time to fully internalize it. Now, models of emotion that's a whole other talk, and I'm going to give you a very quick. There's a lot of different models of emotion. This is one that I particularly like. It's been validated well and validated cross-culturally, where you have not just 4 axes, but there's actually a circle that goes around the outside of this. But you have energy on the y-axis and unhappiness to happiness on the x-axis. So you have high energy happy on the right, high energy unhappy on the left, low energy unhappy, and low energy happy. And it turns out if you ask people cross-culturally, given an emotion, where would you put it on the circle? People will do this in really very close to the same spot across cultures. This is a little hard to remember, and I've got a couple examples. The one that I think probably resonates best is you can think of Tigger is in the upper right corner. He's high energy happy. Pooh is in the low right corner. He's low energy happy. Rabbit is high energy unhappy. And Eeyore is low energy unhappy. This also works with the Seinfeld characters. Kramer, Jerry, Elaine, and George. One of the reasons is this actually goes back to, like if any of you have done Myers-Briggs or things like that, these are all based on some of the same Jungian roots, and this actually goes back to the Middle Ages, in Italy called the Commedia dell'arte, where they would say, we're doing The Mayor's Wife, that's the play, and there's no lines for it, but you're the chambermaid and you're the lord who's been hidden. Okay, great, everyone go. And they know what their parts are because they know the personality of those parts. And so it works for us. Now, whether this is something that's been encultured and works for us that way, or if this is really tapping into something deep within us, hard to say. The fact that it works cross-culturally is interesting to me too. There's a lot more I could say on that, but I'm going to restrict myself to that. The point that I want to make here is that we can create emotional experiences in games, and that the more we do this, again, we're digging deeper and deeper and deeper with each one of these layers. We can get to some really deep, meaningful aspects of gameplay where people will keep a game with them in their hearts, their reflective attention, for a long time. The next one beyond that, and this is the last one that I know of, is called cultural interactivity. And this is probably the least explored aspect of interactivity that we have thus far. This is where we ask questions about who are we as a people. If you think about it, slavery in the United States was a question that we had to deal with as a people for more than 100 years. In some ways, we are still dealing with it. Is marijuana legal? Okay to legalize? This is a conversation we're having today. That's going to take a long. It's been going on for a long time. It will go on for a long time. I'm not saying we should make games or need to make games about legalizing marijuana. You can if you want, but there are conversations like this that we have as a people, and that games can help us understand, again, with the same kind of reflective attention. My favorite example of this is a game called Train. So this is a game this is not the kind of game you're going to find at GameStop or something. It's mostly an art installation game made by Brenda Romero. Very simple game setup. We have a window over some broken glass and some train tracks, and the rules themselves are really kind of ambiguous. You're not quite sure what to do, except that you need to get these little yellow pegs into the train cars and get them to their destination. As you play the game, what you find out is that you at some point you turn over your card, that's your destination card, and it will say something like Auschwitz or Buchenwald. What you are doing in this game is taking Jews to the concentration camps. When people discover that, what they feel is that they have been complicit all along. They were following the rules, which is the experience that many people in Germany had as well. They were following the rules. We didn't know what we were doing was wrong until you do. So this is a great example of a piece of cultural reflectivity. It's being able to interact with our culture and understand who we are and why we do things like this. By the way, the responses that people have to this are amazing. People break down in tears. My favorite is a guy who would not leave until every last peg was taken out of every last car. I mean, it can be a really moving experience. It's also the kind of thing that where the signs are right there in front of you. This is based on this window with broken glass under it, which is evoking Kristallnacht. There's a typewriter that Brenda has, which is that she typed up the cards with, that is an actual Nazi typewriter. It's creepy and chilling and extremely effective. There are a couple other examples I've heard of, and I'd love to hear from you all if you know of examples of games that get to this kind of cultural interactivity and cultural conversation that we can have, not person to person, but person to society and back. And this is something that I think we can and really need to explore more as we go on. So how do these work together? There's a thing that we can look at called the interactivity budget, where we can look at all these kinds of interactivity from the action feedback all the way to the cultural, from fast to slow, from reflexive to executive to reflective. And what we see is that people can only have so much interactivity. We have a budget, and once you spend it, it's gone. So if you want to have a reflective, emotional, cultural experience, you don't want to have Peggle. Peggle's a great experience, but Peggle is a fast, action feedback, short-term cognitive experience that doesn't do much else at all. Because if it does, then one pushes out the other, and the fast will push out the slow, the sort of reflexive will push out the reflective. There's a great bit of research done by Quantic Foundry where they have interviewed surveyed more than 300,000 gamers and came up with this graphic that shows that on the y-axis here you have how exciting is a game. How much does it depend on fast action? And on the x-axis, how strategic is the game? How much does it depend on thinking about things slowly? So you have Europa Universalis way out far on it's not an exciting game, folks, but it's a great one. And you have League of Legends way high up on the y-axis. And what they found is that there is nothing in the upper right-hand quadrant because people just can't handle, our brains can't handle that much interactivity. You're not going to, if you set out to make something that has a lot of action, and I get this from game designers sometimes, they say, oh, it's going to have a lot of action and a lot of thought and really deep strategy. No, people will check out. It's too much for us. So this is one example of how you can graph out the different kinds of interactivity. Just by the way, the shaded grays there are the easy fun, medium fun, and hard fun. So if you want to play an easy game, it's not going to be too taxing on any of the cognitive domains, and it's probably going to be much more on the perceptual domain, the action feedback domain. So understanding this and understanding the different kinds of interactivity allows us then to talk about some other things, like, for example, emergence. So I'm leaping over a bunch of stuff here in the interest of time, but emergence is one of the goals for a lot of game designers, because you want to have gameplay where the player can interact with the game world, and create new things, and have things emerge that you didn't plan on happening, rather than having everything having to be set Dave Marks is a AI designer. He said no designer intervention needed when you have something that has a lot of emergence in it. Some of the requirements for emergence are when you have parts that are connected that form loops and the behaviors themselves are local, generic, and modular. That sounds really kind of boring, I realize, but if you think of them as if my parts are Legos, I can put them together any way I want. If part A can only go with part B, I've just collapsed down the space of stuff I can make, and emergence isn't going to happen. So we want to have these sort of conceptual Legos. And what happens when we get this is it creates things like this. This is from Conway's Game of Life. Not really a game exactly, but so what's happening here is there are just a very few rules, and this is an animated sequence, but in Conway's Life, every cell can either be on or off. The on ones are black, the off ones are white, and it depends on which ones are on around you in any given time tick. But what happens is you can get repeating patterns like this. So this is called a flyer or a glider, and it goes down and to the right. There are lots of different kinds of gliders, lots of different kinds of self-replicating patterns. These are patterns that we call they're called metastable patterns because the pattern itself is changing all the time. But if you zoom out one level and say, okay, this is a thing, this is a glider going down and to the right, we can see metastable structures happening in all kinds of situations, in all kinds of games that arise because there is emergence in the game. So in games, we do see emergence in a lot of forms. Role-playing game guilds, the auction house on any online game is a fantastic version of an emergent structure. And then we go to things like Go. I love the game of Go for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is it is so incredibly austere. It's got black and white discs on a regular board and nothing else. So the action feedback here is very small. You're not going to get Ode to Joy and a rainbow out of Go. You're going to get, interesting move. So there's a lot of cognition, a lot of very deep cognition because Go has this ability to make emergent structures that happen at multiple levels of depth. So as a player, as a really good player, what you get is not memorized move like you sometimes get in chess, but the ability to see patterns at multiple levels of abstraction. The really master Go players can see all these levels, think about level upon level upon level of these loops that are interacting, forming these patterns. And that's what Go is. So this builds really strong connections within the player, between the player and the game, and between the player and other players. And this also then points us to this whole thing about emergence. I want to now point us to things outside of games for a moment. Because emergence is just not just in games by any means. This is a little poem by D.H. Lawrence called The Third Thing. He was really fascinated by what makes water wet. If you think about it, an H2O molecule has none of the properties of being wet, and yet water is wet. We perceive it to have those kinds of qualities. It turns out we do, in fact, know what makes water wet. I actually found a paper that talks about hexamers of water molecules, that they form little groups of 6. And they're basically like little jello blobs. They resonate like this. And when you get a whole bunch of those passing by each other, you get the effects of liquid water. But the point remains that there is nothing, Lawrence's third thing, there's nothing in the water molecule that makes it wet. That's an emergent property that happens one level up from the water molecule. And we can see this happening in all kinds of situations. So this is a graphic depiction of a proton where the proton, inside the proton, there are 3 quarks. I'm just deciding how deep do I go down this rabbit hole. Well, we'll try this out. So let me say this. You and everything you know, this table, everything, is more than 99% emergent. So this isn't just about games, this is just about in-game economies. Everything you know is based on emergence and based on these systems within systems within systems. So within a proton, you have 3 quarks that make up the proton, except those 3 quarks actually make up only about 1% of the proton's mass. The other 99.99%, it goes out several digits, are from virtual quarks that pop in and out of existence all the time. This proton is at the heart of a hydrogen atom, which has the proton and 1 electron. And to give you an idea of the scale of this, if the proton is a peppercorn or a BB at the center of a football stadium, the rest of the football stadium is completely empty. No air, no nothing, just emptiness, and there's a little tiny electron out there someplace. That's the hydrogen atom. Now, the hydrogen atom accounts for about 15% of your mass. And most of that mass is from these virtual quarks. So you have the proton, which is an emergent effect of the quarks, the atom, which is an emergent effect of the proton, and it goes on and on and on. So you can see these up into the natural world. This is what's called a bait ball of fish. The reason I love this one is that there is no fish in here that says, guys, do maneuver number 43. We have to form a ball. This is what fish do when they're trying to get away from a predator. They're all trying to get to the center of the school, which makes for the smallest outside surface area, which makes a sphere. So we see these kinds of emergent effects where the fish are forming a sphere, in this case. In the natural world, we already talked about the computational world, where we have this thing that is actually made up of a bunch of disconnected little things, not disconnected, but interconnected little things that make, again, at a higher level, another thing. We have, in the psychological world, we all see a face here. Whenever I put this up, I keep waiting for someone to say, I don't, because there is a neurological deficit where you would see a face here, but it's extremely rare. But there are really only a butterfly, 3 flowers, and 3 leaves. But we all see the emergent face there because that's how we perceive the world. In the same way, a relationship is an emergent quality. No one who's at my university, at Indiana University today, was there 100 years ago. And yet the university persists. Even if nobody who was at MAGFest this year comes back next year, which isn't going to happen, but MAGFest would still persist. So we see these kinds of things where you have interacting parts together, whether it's 2 people or an institution or billions of stars in a galaxy, all making emergent effects one level up from wherever they are. This is something that we see throughout the natural and psychological world. Okay, so that was a brief detour out into outer space. So what does all this mean? If we can make better systems, we can make better games. If you understand how to look at your game and say, or what you're trying to do in a game and say, is this an engine? Is this an ecology? Is this an economy? How can I put these together to make interesting gameplay? How can I make this a way that the player has interesting things they can do in the game and can learn more easily because we learn systems more easily than we learn sort of ad hoc things that aren't put together well. So if we understand systems, we can make better games. Understanding systems, I'm convinced, makes better game designers and not incidentally better people. Because understanding systems is a critical skill that we need for this century. One of the things that I really believe is that systems understanding is to the 21st century what literacy was to the 20th century. You could get by in the first couple decades of the 20th century without really know how to read and write very well and still be okay. By the end of the 20th century, if you didn't know how to read and write, you were really excluded from society. In the same way, most of us, frankly, don't have a really good idea about how to think in systems very well or operate with a systems understanding. But that's going to change. Our world is so interconnected that a misplaced banking policy in Indonesia can have dramatic results on your ability to buy a house in the United States. Everything is interconnected. And not like, well, everything's interconnected, but in ways that we can recognize as systems rather than being randomly interconnected. So that the final thing here is that I believe that if we make more systemic games, that we can come to understand systems better in the game and out of the game. A number of years ago, we were trying to sell our house and trying to figure out what price to sell the house for. And my kids were trying to understand, how do you price a house? How does it even work? And we were talking about it, and my daughter at one point said, oh, I get it. It's just like the auction house on WoW. I'm like, yes, it is exactly like that. If I have a really rare item on the auction house, I'm going to watch the prices for a little bit, and I'm going to go, oh, you know what? I bet I can sell this item for this much money. It's exactly the same thing with a house. That's a systemic understanding that she had about the auction house, and she was able to understand things about a very different area because of her understanding the game. So I believe that we can, as we make better games, we'll be able to help people see things better in the world around them. So to sum up, I think we want to avoid ad hoc, content-driven, and I realize a lot of stuff here I haven't gone over in this short talk, but sort of single-purpose content in games. We want to create games with different parts and behaviors that all work together well, Lego-like, to create different systems. We need to include the player as part of these systems so they can connect with it. Just get to the end of this here. And then using the different kinds of interactivity, paying attention to the player's interactivity budget, we can make for better gameplay and use these game loops to make emergent systems and overall make games that help people see the systems beyond games. Now, the last thought I have is what I tell my students. If this is hard, you're doing it right. If you look at a game, you say, oh, well, that was pretty easy to make. I could make that game. I could make Dwarf Fortress. I could make Europa Universalis. No problem. When you really start digging into it, and especially if you're using a systemic approach, it definitely becomes hard, but that's when you know that you're doing it right. So that's it. Thanks very much. And I'm happy to take questions on this or, Rampart or anything else. Yeah.
So just a bit of clarification. When you say, we need to start thinking in terms of systemic game design in general, are you referring to specifically games that are trying to be systemic, or do you think we need a more systemic approach to Peggle?
Good question. I love Peggle. I love Call of Duty. Those are two very content-driven games. Call of Duty a lot more than Peggle, actually. Games where you're dependent on. There was an old version of it's actually Allied Assault that I played this one level a couple times and I realized, wait a minute, this level is completely linear. And I went back and played it again. It turns out most of the levels are completely linear. In most content-driven games, you have a linear path, and what that does is it increases your costs and reduces your replayability. So there are studios and there are people that make content-driven games really, really well. But there's something that game developers talk about, which is the content treadmill, which is if I have a primarily content-driven game, then I have chained myself to that, and I'm going to keep the game going, especially if it's an online game, or if I'm going to have DLC and anything else, I'm going to have to keep putting out new content for it. As opposed to, say, something like Minecraft, which is highly systemic. So if I make a game that has lots of systems embedded in it, and the players can discover those systems, and there's the adequate feedback loop for the players, then I can do an awful lot with very little content. So to some degree, it's a philosophical position where we make better games, we make games that conform more to reality, we make games that help us see the systems around us by making systemic games. The other part is purely practical. It's a lot cheaper and ultimately less risky to make a systemic game than a content-driven game. Yeah?
So you're saying that we can't, we have a attention budget, so to speak. How much can you flex that? I could imagine some sort of game that gave you sort of a couple of ways of viewing the world, where you would have like an overarching map where you do all kinds of very high-level strategy, not very much was happening. High, here.
So high strategy, high long-term cognitive, and
Low
yeah.
excitement.
So try and get both of those corners.
And then additionally had a second thing where you just like moved into some kind of local battle where it's like your high-level strategy here would change what you did in the battle, but you wouldn't really be thinking about it during the battle.
So there's a couple answers. There's just the questions about how much can you stretch people's interactivity budget. The short answer is, again, a couple different answers. One is that you can stretch it, definitely. You get better at Tetris, which is increasing your how fast can you respond to things. You get better at any strategy game. You're able to take on more and more challenges. And this is the way we learn anything. You get better at things, you can take on more stuff. However, there are also styles that people prefer. So some people just prefer something fast action, some people prefer something slower. In fact, one of the things that the Quantic Foundry guys have found is that the single biggest motivation for players that decreases with age is the desire for fast action and competition. So you may like a lot of really competitive games in your 20s. By the time you're a little older, like some of us, it's not as motivating to go out and whack people so much. So like, I'm not going to be a star PUBG player. That's just not going to happen, And part of that is the age motivation. The other thing, though, is that there are all these different kinds of interactivity are fatiguing. The faster ones recover the fastest as well. So if you have a game that has lots of fireworks and explosions and things like that, if those come at you too much for too long, people will stop playing. There's a great example. I'm trying to think of the name of the game. I'll come back to it. But you can only take that for so long, and then you have fatigue where it drops off. Then it comes right back up again. So in a lot of action games, a lot of platformers, what you'll have is fast action parts and then rest parts. Fast action, rest. Because people need to recover from that. the more executive and reflective the action is, the longer it takes to recover. So if you play Train, you're not going to want to go back and play it 10 minutes later, maybe ever later. But even if you have a game that is just really deeply emotional, where there's some cathartic experience that happens, you may want to take a day or a week before you have another experience like that, because we need that recovery time. So it is possible, I think, to create a game where you have long-term strategy or deep social or emotional things going on paired with fast action in small bites. I haven't seen it done well yet. I've seen people try it and fail because, I think in part because the game forces you to do one or the other. You may just want to say, no, hang on a minute. I just want to go back and we talk about fight or flight. We also talk about tend and befriend. You want to go back and just say, I want to tend my garden for a little bit. So if you had a game where you, I don't know, were building a castle and had an army, you could fight that army, but then at a time where you could just go back and tend the garden in the castle, that might be a nice respite that could make that kind of thing work. So yeah, I think it's possible. Haven't seen it done yet. Yeah. I was thinking about Total War when I was talking about that, except Total War doesn't have any low tension points that I can think of. None of the Total War games I've played, they all have some tension. If I'm playing Rome and I don't marry this guy to the right girl, then things are going to go horribly out of whack. And by the way, this army is still out in the field over here. So I just want time where I can say, go tend your garden. Actually, a game that does that pretty well is Plants vs. Zombies, where they have the Tree of Enlightenment, I think. It's been a long time. But that's actually you tend your garden and you build the tree and things like that. So that's as opposed to the pressure of having zombies coming at you all the time. Any other questions? Yeah?
So for the emergence to happen, if we have these modular, these looping mechanisms that are modular, generic, I guess I'm having a hard time sticking that with any kind of linear storyline or development, and how you would keep the same modularity.
Well spotted. Systemic games thus far have not done narrative very well, and vice versa. Part of that is because in doing narrative games, what we're often trying to do is to pick up the forms of fiction or stories in books and movies and things like that we've had for 3,000 years. We know how to do that really, really well. We're trying to graft that into games, and thus far it hasn't worked really well in that there are games that have great story, but they don't tend to have a lot of deep systems attached to them. There may be some systems in there, but the systems aren't driving the train. The story's driving the train. Again, I think this is a really active area for research where we don't yet know if is that as good as it can get, or do we just need to work on this more? We're just now starting to talk about game systems this way. This is part of a larger field of some people call game grammar. As we come to understand how these grammars work and how to use them well, people go, oh, you know what? I can put a narrative in here, or I can braid the narrative together with this in ways that we just don't understand yet. Yeah?
How would you say Dwarf Fortress handles narrative in its game? It doesn't use the typical narrative structures, but it does have a persistent world with some things that you can find from previous game sessions, some legacies that build over time.
Right. So I never thought I would say this, but I think Dwarf Fortress in a lot of ways may point the way toward effective narrative in games. If anyone quotes me on that, what I mean is that a lot of purely systemic games, and it's hard for me to think of a game that's more systemic than Dwarf Fortress is. Just really quickly, you guys know about the thing about cats dying in Dwarf Fortress? I love this story.
The cat explosion.
Well, not the cat explosion.
The cat in the bar?
So this guy found a bunch of cats dead all over the game, and whenever he found them, they would have a pool of vomit next to them. He's like, what's going on? Is this some bug or like that? And what he eventually figured out was this is an intersection, like a whole bunch of meshing systemic gears coming together. Cats are in bars in the taverns in the game because the rats are in taverns. Dwarves are in taverns because they like to drink. Dwarves are messy, so they spill wine on the floor. Cats pick up the wine because they're on the floor. Cats are one of two animals, the other being red pandas, which tells you something about the games, that it has red pandas. But those are the only two animals in the game that have a self-cleaning feature. When they clean themselves, they ingest whatever is on them. So a cat is in a bar to find rats, gets wine splashed on it, and some of the things are things like wine on fourth toe of back left foot. Again, the detail there. The cat ingests the wine by cleaning itself. Because cats have a very small mass, they die of alcohol poisoning and throw up and die. None of that was planned. All of that is a whole bunch of different systems coming together to create a really cool, perverse, emergent result. So, another example along those lines is the tantrum spirals, where if you have one dwarf that does something as simple as drops his hammer, and he can start to tantrum, and if the other guys aren't happy, they'll start to tantrum, and you can lose an entire fortress that way. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. It's like stopping a hurricane. What I see there, though, is that none of that is planned narrative. So if we want to have authorial control, where we say this is the narrative of this game, you're not going to get that in Dwarf Fortress. I think there are really interesting ways to take a pointer from Dwarf Fortress, take that direction, and say, and this is, I think, that we can make really interesting character-driven narrative where I, as a player, become invested in some characters in the game. Imagine that I could get to know my dwarves, and I could, get to know who they are and what their history is and what they're doing and why they're trying to do all this, and help them make decisions or follow their decisions. I could tell an entire epic myself. People have told, fan fiction type stories of Dwarf Fortress and of a lot of other games like this. That's a new kind of narrative. That's a narrative where what I experience is going to be entirely different from what you experience. So you're never going to get the Count of Monte Cristo out of that. Or if you do, it's going to be different for me than it is for you. Now, I think we can sort of envision that. The next step beyond that is, how do I tell Count of Monte Cristo or Casablanca or Macbeth while still allowing for that kind of variability? I have no idea. We'll figure it out.
That feels very much like D&D stories, right?
Yeah, exactly. D&D stories are awesome if you were there. I worked in a game store many, many years ago, and one of those painful things was having someone come in at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning and tell me the awesome story about what happened the night before. The problem was I could sit there and think, okay, but my story was pretty awesome. But if I tell it to somebody else, it's going to be kind of just as strange or boring as that.
How do you make that universally enjoyable?
That's the question. And I don't think we know yet, but I think we can get there. I don't think we can get there without employing systems underneath it all. By just making more content, all we're going to have is more content. And we already have 3,000 years of content. But I think by making narrative that is based on these kinds of systems, we can, I believe, get to something that is much more universal. Hasn't been proven yet. We don't know if we can do it. But yeah, do you have some here? Yeah.
I just had a thought. If you took something like Dwarf Fortress, which is very, very systemic, I imagine a good game designer could potentially sit down and design a Dwarf Fortress map for a story.
Now you're sort of hypothesizing about a good game designer. I suspect there are things you can do with a systemic game like Dwarf Fortress or like Minecraft where you could create story maps that map onto that. Again, it hasn't been done yet. I'm not saying it can't be done. I absolutely think it can. I just don't think we've had the tools thus far to really think about these things in a way that we could get there.
I feel like there was a game that was on the games you might not have tried from extra credits it was the history of the world in a combat thing. Or it was like World War II, but like every unit was placed correctly, and it mostly follows the narrative.
Yeah, but the thing is, the closer you get to let's place every unit where it was and tell the story, now you're telling the story, not letting the player experience the story, and there's really no room for systems being involved there to help the player understand the world as it operates. If you don't understand how these army units operate, you're just not going to understand it because there's no system there to help you understand it. Anything else? I think they were sort of telling us we need to get going here soon. Yeah, in the back here. Or middle. I can make them available, and this is as much of a plug as I'll do, you can buy my book. All this came from the book. There's a lot more in there as well. But yeah, I can, I'm not sure they aren't available right now, but I can try and make them available. I'm not sure if there's something through MAGFest where there's a central repository or anything like that, but I can certainly make them available, yeah. In the orange shirt there, yeah. Say again? Advanced Game Design, a Systems Approach. It's on Amazon. I should have had like a picture of it here in the last slide, but it was as much as I could do to put it in the first slide. Yeah.
I was wondering if you thought that the episodic approach to an open world game, like how Breath of the Wild did its narrative, is something that more games should focus on in the future, or do you think that it might be going in the wrong direction?
I don't want to say that something's going in the wrong direction. I mean, there are linear games that are wonderful games. There are open world games that are wonderful games. I think when we try and mix the two, I think Breath of the Wild is a really interesting attempt to mix the two, and there have been many of these, and there will be many more. a lot of the times what we see when those kinds of mixes happen is you have a space for play that opens up where you can make lots of different decisions and then closes down. And there's a single cutscene you need to go through at the end. So no matter what decisions you make in the middle, you're going to get to the same cutscene everybody else got to. And cutscenes are wonderful because they allow the developers to have this authorial control again. They say, this is how I want things to happen. But it also takes away the agency for the player because no matter what decisions you made before that, it doesn't really matter now. So that's the balance point. How do we make things where the players always feel like their decisions matter, which increases their and maintains their engagement, while still having some kind of story you want to tell about the world? Again, it's an open question. I don't think I think I have some ideas for how to do it, but that may take the rest of my life to figure those things out. I don't know. Yeah.
So one really interesting thing, I saw a YouTube video on sort of emergent narrative. It's on GDC's or the GDC YouTube channel, and one of the things was about Crusader Kings 2.
Yeah.
And how they have the sort of the relationship systems of the characters, which have stats that are randomly generated. But there's also sort of like certain pre-planned things, and how players were getting stories out of kind of like the Dwarf Fortress stories. And a lot of it was completely a chance, and there was sort of the element of like you didn't necessarily know if the story was something that was pre-planned by the developers as you were playing through it, or if it was something that just occurred by chance. And like one of them was where, and this was more of an obvious, like it was a chance thing, but where the Joan of Arc savior of France in the Hundred Years' War also happened to be like the Antichrist.
Yeah. So this point about not knowing whether this is a pre-written story or something that just emerged out, I think that's really a really good goal. In a way that I almost look at that as like the Turing test for game narrative. If I can't tell if it was pre-written or not, that's really good, because if it has that much importance to me, and yet you can get to really weird things like Crusader Kings 2 there's a famous story of this online where a guy was able to make a horse Holy Roman Emperor, if I have that right. Yeah. It's crazy, and took a lot of planning, and somebody who knew the game really, really well. That's someone who's using the systems of the game to subvert them to tell the story he wants to tell, this horse becoming Holy Roman Emperor or Pope or something. I don't remember now, but it was pretty crazy. But also very interesting just in terms of how that game evolved. And you could say, oh, someone wrote that story beforehand, and say, well, that's weird, why would you want to do that? But maybe it's, like you said, a story about Joan of Arc that you experienced in the game that may or may not have been written beforehand, which is pretty cool. Hand in the back, yeah.
I have a question on Angry Birds. And what I mean by that is, I read an article about the psychological effect of how the designers, they create a simple system.
Right.
They've realized that, like say just shooting the bird, right? They've realized that for some people, there was a certain speed that the bird had to travel in the system. And if it was too slow, people got bored. If it was too fast, it was too much. I was wondering, where is the psychological part a part of that systemic game design, or is it outside of the whole game design theory and you just bounce it between the two?
No, I think
If you create the system, then I guess human feedback or is the psychological? I mean, you have a part in there.
Yeah.
I don't know if is the psychological part more important than the systemic, or is the systemic, like, can you create, you see what I'm getting?
I think so. So let me just, because I don't know if everyone could hear that, but the question about Angry Birds and the fact that they had to make the birds fly fast enough but not too fast, and give the player different things to aim at and different ways to, like, for example, in Angry Birds, the number of dots you have showing the bird's path turns out to be really important. How well you can predict what's going to happen next. So your question's an excellent one. The question is that psychological, or is that within the game, or something else? So you remember I had the systems within the player's head, the psychology part, the systems within the game itself, and then the overall system of the interaction. And that's multiple levels of systems right there. And what we have, this is a really good example of this being in both. So you have, the player needs to be able to form an intention. If I pull back at this angle this much, I can see where the path is going to go. And then if the bird flies fast enough, not too slow, not too fast. If I fly too fast, I can't see what happened. Too slow, my reflexive attention doesn't keep up. So then you fly fast enough and then have a discernible effect so that if it doesn't do what I thought it was going to do, that's interesting. That's feedback from the game to the player. And the player then says, okay, let me try that again. So I'm going to form another intention and pull it slightly differently, a little further back, a little further down, something like that. And again, you have this refinement of the player's understanding of the physical system of like the box physics in the game itself, within the structures itself. That the gameplay, what you're doing there is really a combination of this perceptual or action feedback and short-term cognitive. There's not a lot of strategy, not a lot of long-term strategy in Angry Birds. But you have this, I want to plan a little bit and then see what happens, and it's cool when things fall and break apart and stuff like that. So that's the action feedback reward that you get for doing something well. But one of the reasons I said this is a good question is we sometimes get sucked into thinking this either has to be in the player or in the game, and the answer is it's in both. Because if you don't have that loop that goes between the two, you don't really have a good game. And that's, again, one of the things that it's easy to say in an abstract sense like this. When it really comes down to designing a game, you say, okay, I've got this system where these units move this fast or this strong or do this kind of thing. How do I reflect that back to the player through feedback so they can understand that system, form intentions about how to change it, and then do something which then perturbs the system internally. And that's game design in a nutshell right there. Any last questions at all? Yeah, one last one.
So this is a tough thing to phrase, but so I'm thinking about I think in effect you talked about the emotional intensity of something and how that helps you.
It's difficult.
Yeah, it's fine. So there's games that tell stories, right?
Yeah.
But I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and there's games like Breath of the Wild, which you can do whatever you want, but in the end it tells the same story, right?
Right.
Then there's a game like Undertale, where you can make decisions, but it ends up telling you the same story either way, so it's more linear. Then there's games like Minecraft, where it doesn't tell you a story, you can do whatever you want. And then the last quadrant is something like a David Cage game, where you can do whatever you want, but the story, it tells you a story, but the story isn't internally, emotionally consistent. So my question is basically, do you think it's possible to give you a lot of choices and also tell the same internal consistent message?
This goes back to the question somebody else asked earlier. Can we create an overarching narrative that is the same for all players while giving the players their agency? This is one of the fundamental battles in game design between the ludologists, quote unquote, and narratologists. Can you tell narrative and have gameplay at the same time? Thus far, the answer has been no, or only in limited places. I'm gonna let you have a little bit of latitude here, but you play Portal, you can solve the problems in different ways, but you're going to encounter GLaDOS, and there's nothing you can do about that. You can't make GLaDOS weaker earlier on or something like that by your actions. So you're going to tell the same story. So it's really an unsolved problem. I think that, personally, I think that by looking at things systemically and with the careful application of some AI in the non-player characters, we have the chance of having the characters tell us stories that may be overall the same. So you might have a game like This War of Mine where you're telling a story about civilian life in wartime, and overall that story is the same, but the individual events are all going to be different. That's maybe as close as I can get to how we do that right now is a game like that. But I think we just have a whole lot of work left to do, which actually I see as a very hopeful sign. I can't remember who says this now, but there's a game company that says the best games are yet to be made. I absolutely believe that. And I believe it because I can see these things that would be really wonderful if we could do them. We just have no idea how to do them yet. So that's why I work on stuff like this to try and maybe make this a little bit better. So hopefully one of you will go out and create a game that tells the same story in a really cool narrative way, that has amazing systems underneath, that allows the players to have lots of agency and engagement. So go forth and design. Thanks very much, everyone.